And when I began work on this book 2 or 3 years ago, I thought I knew everything about oil. I had written a book called Resource Wars. Some of you may be familiar with that, in which I talked about oil. But I didn't really grasp the centrality of oil when I worked on that. I knew that oil was important to the American economy. It was crucial to transportation in this country, and it provides about 2/5, 40% of our total energy supply, and more than any other source, but a very large part of America's total energy. That much I knew, but I didn't grasp the centrality of this substance for our economy and our way of life. And the more I studied it, the more astounded I became about how crucial oil is to everything in this society. Oil is an industry. Oil production in the U.S., marketing, refining, retailing, accounts for about 5% of our total GNP. Not that big a percentage. However, oil touches everything in the American economy, and therefore when there's a shortage of oil, which has occurred periodically in 1973, in 1979, in 1999, and now there's a shortage again, it affects the economy directly, and all of the recessions since World War II in this country and the world were caused or precipitated by a shortage of oil and an increase in oil price. So oil is essential to the American economy. The second thing about oil I want to say is that we've become addicted to this, by which I mean that our economy and our way of life has become hardwired to having cheap and plentiful petroleum. You know, a century ago, even more recently than that, people traveled by train and trolley from city to city and to village. You know, you think we've made progress in the intervening years, but 75 years ago in Amherst, you could take a trolley from here to any community in the Pioneer Valley, electric trolleys that were fast, efficient, affordable, and non-polluting. And you could take a train from Amherst to Boston a dozen times a day, faster than you can now by car, at least when there's any traffic pileup, which is most of the time. That's the way people travel. All of that has been eliminated. Some would say as a result of conspiracies by the oil companies and automobile manufacturers to destroy the trolley tracks that once connected all of America. All of the new housing built in this country the past 20 years, virtually all of it has been beyond the beltways in the outer suburbs, sprawled out all across America, far from public transit. So the only way most people now could get to work is by driving, often very long distances. And this is what I mean by we've become addicted to having this substance. The third thing I want to say about oil that you need to know, we all need to know, is that when we became addicted to oil, which was around World War II, beginning in the 1920s and 30s, but especially after World War II, the United States produced virtually all of the oil that we consumed. The United States was then the world's leading oil producer, and we had within our own territory plentiful supplies of cheap petroleum, making possible the automobilization, the motorization, the suburbanization of America with domestic oil. And I would argue that a large part of the immense wealth acquired by people in this country after World War II was made possible by this availability of cheap domestic oil. But we no longer produce most of the oil we consume. In 1998, we crossed the 50% mark, and now we rely on imports for about 60% of our petroleum, and in another 10 years or so, it's going to be 70%, and then 80% and 90%, because we're using up what's left of our domestic supply of oil, and we're relying more and more on oil imported from elsewhere. You may have heard about the concept of peak oil, the moment at which the world will reach maximum attainable output. Some people think that we're at that point now, that in 2000 or so we reach the point of maximum oil production worldwide, or we're going to reach that in the next 5 to 10 years. I'm not an expert enough to tell you whether that's true or not. What I can tell you, and this is the fifth and final point I want to make about oil, is that the center of gravity of oil production is shifting. It was at one point primarily concentrated in what we would call the global north, that is the industrialized countries, North America, the North Sea, industrialized Russia, industrialized China, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. About 50% or more of it was production. This is day-to-day production, not reserves, but production. But that's no longer true. Increasingly, most of the day-to-day production is going to move to what we call the global south, the developing countries, what we used to call the third world. And primarily, as I say, it's the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America where most future production is going to come from. And these are areas that historically have been very unstable. And so we're moving from in areas where you could think of our oil as being safe, and we're moving to areas where the oil that we depend on to maintain our way of life is coming from areas that can be considered chronically unstable. Now this leads to the second part of my discussion of these three parts: oil, war, and American foreign policy. War.